Greetings all, and welcome to the 7th episode of the V.T.P, or the Veteran Trainer's Perspective. Today, we are going to be examining a small aspect of the Pokémon world that I, as a man that loves paleontology and the history of life in general on this planet, have paid great attention to and have quite a bit to say about. Today, we are going to be taking a look at fossil Pokémon, and in particular, whether or not they can truly be resurrected at all the way they can be in the world of Pokémon. Now, the first thing that needs to be obviously addressed is the simplest of questions for this inquiry. What exactly is a fossil Pokémon? In short, a fossil Pokémon is a species of Pokémon that possesses the same combat characteristics as modern Pokémon, but is otherwise normally and naturally extinct in the wild. These creatures have been brought back to life through the use of advanced cloning technology that can supposedly supplement gaps in degraded genetic material in order to create an organism that is as close to the original life form the fossil came from as possible, in turn bringing the species or family back to life. The actual technology used in this process is somewhat primitive compared to what modern technology might make it out to be, but the process has been perfected to ensure a successful cloning with any fossil sample, provided that it has genetic material preserved in it. Now, this by itself seems all well and good, and it is, at face value. However, in reality, things are not so simple at all, and what I have come here to argue today is that not only is this process much more difficult than it seems initially, but, in the vast majority of cases, that the reality of the situation is that there is no way that these fossils could possibly be resurrected to create living creatures even remotely similar to the organism they're supposed to come from. To start off with, let's take a look at how a fossil forms in the first place and how this process can change depending on the environmental circumstances. Typically, when it comes to the preservation of hard parts, which are the easiest parts to preserve, it requires that an organism that has recently died be covered up in some fashion or another and buried. Over time, the process of decay, as well as heat and pressure from overlying material after burial, destroys the soft tissue, but hard parts like bones are preserved, as the living tissue inside is slowly replaced with mineral deposits, resulting in the object turning into stone over time and thus a fossil. However, this is only the typical way in which this occurs. There are also cases of soft-bodied preservation, where the burial process is so quick that microorganisms do not have the time to start to break down the soft tissue, and instead, heat and pressure generated from the burial process evaporates the volatiles out of the soft tissue, leaving only the carbon in its body behind as a flattened, preserved sample. Moreover, there are other miscellaneous ways in which a specimen can be preserved, such as through extreme cold, desiccation or drying out, salt preservation, polymerization, pyritization, and so on and so forth. What's important to understand here for this particular examination is, by virtue of the ways in which ancient life can be preserved, what sorts of things are typically preserved. In the overwhelming majority of the time, the only thing that really gets preserved in a fossil are the hard parts. This is primarily because they are not easily damaged or destroyed by the forces of heat and pressure and do not readily decay as a result of their inorganic composition. Bones are the most obvious example as already highlighted, as while the delicate soft matter inside of them, like the marrow and blood vessels, will readily decay after some time, the harder parts made with calcium and other inorganic mineral compounds will remain, taking on a different form as they are transformed by the fossilization process. This is why bones and hard parts like shells made from calcium carbonate have such staying power, and thus why they are overwhelmingly common compared to fossils created via different means. However, this is not always the case, as special environmental circumstances can also result in the preservation of soft materials, but only to a point. Soft-bodied preservation is incredibly rare by volume and only occurs in certain types of deposits known as Lagerstadt deposits, and even then, the environment can be very picky about what gets preserved, with the degree of preservation very much dependent upon what the environment can support and provide. And following down from the preservation of soft tissue, we then come to the real focus of the discussion here. Can the genetic material of an organism be preserved in fossilization in order to be used as a source for the recreation of an ancient organism? The short answer to that is no, or at least not in the way that the Pokémon games show it, and I'll explain why. DNA, though an incredible storage device for information, is not impenetrable in the slightest. In fact, DNA does degrade naturally, as the bonds that keep its double helix structure together will start to break apart over time on their own. This is part of the reason why DNA is replicated regularly in the cells of living organisms, as it serves to not only build cell numbers, but act as a way of resetting the clock to some degree to keep the material from degrading, though this comes with its own issues, which I will cover shortly. The main point to be driven home here is that DNA does degrade over time. But how fast, you might ask? In truth, an exact timescale for the degradation of this genetic material is not completely known, but a study conducted in 2012 marks that the half-life, or the time it takes for half of the sample of something to break apart and degrade into something else, is 521 years. Now, this seems like a long time, but since the vast majority of fossils likely extend past this date in age, it can be seen that this puts a serious timer on the clock as to when it is possible to still get viable DNA out of a preserved sample. And this is only one factor that makes DNA a pain in the rear to try and get out of a fossil. There is also the natural process of degradation that DNA and chromosomes, which are the form that DNA is typically bundled in within a cell, undergo just from the process of replication itself. When I speak of replication in this sense, I am referring to the process of these structures unwinding and then copying themselves in order to produce the genetic material needed for the process of cell replication to occur. Now, thankfully for life, the process of replication is a fairly orderly process and generally occurs without too much issue, but there are many things that can happen to the material that can cause abnormalities to occur. Simple mutations occurring from the incorrect replication of a component of a DNA strand, such as the changing of a single nucleotide base pair, may produce little to no consequences, but they can sometimes produce complex and/or highly dangerous alterations that can leave DNA damaged or altered in a way that negatively affects the host. More importantly though, even if this process goes smoothly, chromosomes by nature can never replicate fully. This is because replication never ends at the very end of a chromosome, so when replication occurs, a small bit of the ends of the DNA strand is shaved off. Now, on the one hand, chromosomes are protected against this by telomeres, which exist at the ends of DNA strands and basically act as non-coding junk DNA. This material has no real function that is vital to the survival of the larger organism that strand is part of, but that is on purpose, as it means that these bits can be shaved off little by little without affecting the crucial coding DNA that is required for the organism to function. However, even with this said, there is a limit to how many times replication can occur in a single cell, and under normal circumstances, the cells of living organisms have a natural check against all of this, a system that halts replication after so many times in order to preserve the coding active DNA that is needed for full functionality. This also means that, if pushed too far, it can lead to critical degradation in the genetic material, leaving holes that can render the material and the organism it is a part of completely non-functional. With all of this said, we then come back to the crucial question: is it possible to take DNA preserved from a fossil and use it to resurrect the creature? Within the world of Pokémon, these clones are created when fragmented, preserved specimens of DNA from fossil organisms are extracted from within the fossil and are carefully combined with the DNA of a close relative in order to produce a whole, viable DNA sequence that can then be used to resurrect the organism. As a result of this, the creature is never truly resurrected entirely, as it has had parts of its genetic code replaced with modern relatives in order to make it viable, but it is as close as we can really get. But can this really happen? Well, the short answer is no, not a chance. See, the problem with this goes right back to the issue surrounding the reality of a famous movie series by the name of Jurassic Park. In these movies, dinosaur DNA is extracted from preserved samples of amber taken from mosquitoes caught and then fossilized in tree sap as it undergoes the process of polymerization, transforming from an organic product into an organic pseudo-mineral. As we have just highlighted, however, DNA only really has a half-life of 521 years, so by the time that number of years rolls by, half of the genetic material in a specimen will have degraded to the point of likely being beyond repair. Looking then at the DNA of dinosaurs that are millions of years old, it should become quite apparent then that it is unlikely that any viable DNA could ever be found inside such specimens after so long. The same can be said for almost any number of ancient life forms, regardless of the method of preservation. So while modern specimens might have the slimmest chance of this working, and even then only hypothetically, the actual resurrection of ancient Pokémon fossils is, well, to be blunt, misleading and not readily feasible in the vast majority of cases. Interestingly enough, as it stands right now, scientists are wrestling with the possibility of being able to bring back at least one extinct type of organism, the mammoth, but this is only within the realm of possibility because extreme cold is one of the most effective methods of preserving soft tissue and the genetic material inside of it, and even then, it is still something that is yet to be done even if we are on the right path. So if we haven't done that much yet, with the absolute best of circumstances, and yet the process of fossil Pokemon resurrection was supposedly mastered in the 1990s or earlier when the games take place, I don't exactly see how that is realistically possible. Now, if we want to debunk all of this even further, all we have to do is take a look at the actual fossils that fossil Pokemon come from and see that there is very little in the way of viable material that can actually be harnessed, as the only things that are preserved in the vast majority of cases are the hard parts. Dome fossils merely contain the hard exoskeleton of Kabuto, and for it to be preserved, it would have to have had a very high concentration of calcium carbonate in it, which means that there was likely little organic matter to begin with for preservation. The same can be said for claw fossils, even though in this case, the actual bodies of a Norith are soft, hence why in their case it is only their sharp claws that are preserved. Ammonite shells are almost completely made out of calcium carbonate, and the living tissue of one of these creatures has never actually been preserved, so they're a bust as well. Aerodactyl can only be resurrected with old amber, and we've already gone over how that just wouldn't be a viable method for protecting DNA from natural degradation, so that's out automatically. The bodies of Lilyp and their accompanying root fossils are made dominantly out of, well, you guessed it, calcium carbonate, so that's a no-go there as well. Armor fossils, skull fossils, and jaw fossils exist as the preserved remains of bones from ancient organisms, but with the limited half-life of DNA and the fact that Shieldon, Cranidos, and Tyrant are all dinosaurs in their resurrected forms, it can readily be seen that DNA is unlikely to survive within these fossilized remnants. Cover fossils in turn are made from the bony shells of Tortuga, and while not dinosaurs themselves, their preservation issues are shared from the previous trio mentioned. Plume fossils are interesting in that it is the feather shaft of Arcan that is preserved with a feather impression, but this keratin-rich structure has been petrified in fossilization, so it falls under the same issue as bone fossils. Even sail fossils, which are rich in preserved cartilage, are not so safe, as cartilage degrades rapidly compared to bone, and what little is left only exists because of the dense nature of the membrane on the sail and its penchant for excreting a bone-like substance when it is violently compressed that helps to seal part of the soft tissue inside and keep it protected from completely decaying. Though again, the half-life of DNA renders this a moot point. Now, in stating all of this, there are two other things that should be mentioned regarding this that do prove to complicate things a bit. As it turns out, the resurrection of these fossil Pokemon is not completely without merit, if only because of two specific cases. The first thing, or creature as it may be, that needs to be addressed is the one Pokemon that most forget is in fact a fossil Pokemon: Genesect. Though cyborgs now, these creatures were originally resurrected from fossils dating back 300 million years before they were modified and altered into what they are now. We really are not given any other pieces of vital information other than this regarding their resurrection, but seeing as they are insectoids, it is likely that they came from a soft-bodied Lagerstock deposit. We can surmise this because of the need to actually coat them in metal armor rather than just use cerebral implants to control and amplify their power. This suggests that their bodies were not hard like normal fossil Pokemon upon coming back to life, or at least as far as we know, pointing towards a soft-bodied fossil origin. If this is the case, then we could normally say that they too fall under the umbrella of impossibility. But the problem is that we do not know what kind of fossil they were resurrected from, and that is the big problem with understanding these creatures. Because we know very little about their early days, we cannot say for certain that the resurrection was unlikely as the others. Granted, DNA degradation alone can nail this easily, but the lack of absolute certainty should still make one pause for thought. The other thing that should be of particular note here is that, while the vast majority of the fossil Pokémon that are known to exist were indeed extinct before they were resurrected in the lore of the games, there is one exception. And that exception is Kabuto. Shockingly, unlike all of the other fossil Pokémon, these small beasts never at all went extinct. They are very, very rare to find in the wild, but they did exist prior to the fossil resurrection process being perfected, and still exist as they were to this day. Their ability to survive over millions of years is an impressive feat, but they actually hold a greater distinction than that. Though not explicitly stated anywhere, it is likely that, in all truth, these creatures may have been the key to the fossil resurrection process seen in the games. Because modern living specimens do exist, it could have been very easy to take fragmented DNA from a fossil, if we suspend the entirety of the debunking session we just went through, and then use this creature's genetic material to test and perfect the art of filling in the damaged gaps in DNA samples, helping to provide a base from which the process could have been perfected for other fossil Pokémon, and in turn, granting these creatures a special place of recognition among their fossil Pokémon brethren. Now, before we finish this all up, there is probably one last nagging question that is likely still bothering much of you, and it is a question that has bothered me as well. Why are all fossil Pokémon, barring Genesect due to unusual circumstances, rock types? While not related directly to the topic at hand, this is something I might as well explain briefly. In truth, there are two ways you can think about this. From an out-of-game perspective, the fact that these creatures are resurrected from fossils, literally rocks, kind of makes it too easy to simply slap a rock-type assignment to them as a cheeky nod towards their shared origins. From an in-game perspective, though, well, I think our little friend Kabuto can answer that one. You see, unlike other fossil Pokémon, these creatures are assigned as rock types because of the hard, crystalline nature of their exoskeleton and the natural armored defenses it provides them. If we run off of the assumption outlined previously that they were likely the original test subjects for the perfection of the fossil resurrection process, then their DNA base would have been the source code used for the replication process, using it as a sort of guiding light when bringing back the others. The fact that all resurrected fossil Pokémon possess this same sort of hard outer body would then suggest that the genes responsible for the development of the hard outer bodies of Kabuto must have been passed down unintentionally as a part of the cloning process, being spliced in for some reason or another, and thus sharing this type of armored protection with even those with softer bodies than others. It's an interesting goof-up on the part of the scientists responsible for perfecting this technology, but considering the results in-game seem to be quite promising and successful, I suppose one can't blame them for sticking with what they have if it isn't broken. So, to say that the existence of fossil Pokémon might be a bit far-fetched is definitely putting it mildly, as the reality we live in simply couldn't support their resurrection. Every day, though, we are getting closer and closer to potentially making that happen, at least in the best possible preservation scenarios, so perhaps one day it might be possible to at least approach this topic with some level of greater enlightenment. Until then, I think that it's best that we simply enjoy the fantastical notion that they really have been brought to life, if only to embrace the tenacity that life demonstrates to keep on existing even when it really shouldn't. That's all for this episode, so keep your eyes open and minds ready, and I'll see you again soon on the next episode of the V.T.P. Thank you all for watching this video. It is always an honor to be able to speak with you all on the subject of Pokemon in a way that brings me great joy and happiness in my work. If you would like to keep tabs on past and future work, click that subscribe button, check out my work on DeviantArt, and don't be shy about following me on Twitter, where you can find pertinent announcements on upcoming work before it is officially posted. Links to both can be found in the video description. If you would like to support my work and help Miguel and I continue to produce more content for you and improve upon our presentation, please visit us at my Patreon page, which you can also find a link to in the video description. With that, I thank you for watching and I wish you well.